In 44 BC, Rome stood at the absolute peak of its power. Its legions had marched across 3 continents. Its engineers had built roads that stretched from the deserts of Africa to the frozen rivers of Britain. Its generals had crushed every enemy that dared stand before them. And at the center of all of it stood one man, Gaius Julius Caesar. He was not a king. Rome had not had a king in 5 centuries. The very word rex, the Latin word for king, was so poisonous in Roman ears that merely whispering it about a man could destroy his career, his reputation, and ultimately his life. Caesar knew this better than anyone. And yet, the men who killed him on the steps of the theater of Pompey on the Ides of March believed with absolute conviction that he was reaching for exactly that: a crown, a throne, a permanent grip on the Roman world that no Senate, no constitution, and no tradition could ever pry loose. Were they right? That question has haunted historians for 2,000 years. In this documentary, we will tell the story of Julius Caesar the way Rome lived it, not as the tale of a great man tragically cut down, but as the story of a political war so sophisticated, so dangerous, and so personal that it reshaped the entire ancient world. This is not the Caesar of school textbooks. This is the Caesar that Rome feared. To understand what Caesar wanted, you must first understand what Rome was. In 100 BC, the year of Caesar's birth, Rome was not an empire. It was a republic, and that distinction mattered enormously to every man, woman, and child who lived under its shadow. 500 years earlier, the Romans had done something extraordinary. They had thrown out their kings. The last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, had been expelled from the city in 509 BC after a scandal so severe that the Roman people collectively decided they would never again allow a single man to hold absolute power over them. What replaced the monarchy was a system of breathtaking complexity and deliberate balance. 2 consuls elected every year shared executive power. Neither could act without the other. The Senate, a body of several hundred aristocratic men, controlled finances, foreign policy, and the machinery of government. Tribunes of the people held the power of veto over any legislation they considered harmful to ordinary Romans. The entire system was engineered around one central fear: that one man might accumulate too much power. And for 5 centuries, more or less, it had worked. But by the time Caesar was born, the Republic was cracking. The problem was simple and devastating. Rome had grown too large for the system designed to govern it. A constitution built for a city-state was now trying to manage an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. Generals who spent years campaigning in distant provinces returned home with personal armies loyal to them rather than to the Senate. Wealth flooded into Rome from conquered territories. and pooled in the hands of a tiny aristocratic elite, while ordinary Romans lost their farms and crowded into the city's slums. The gap between rich and poor had become a chasm, and into that chasm ambitious men threw torches. The generation before Caesar had already produced two of them, Marius and Sulla, two generals who had each in their turn marched armies on Rome itself, seized power by force, and demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that the old rules no longer applied. Sulla, in particular, had left a mark that never fully healed. He had made himself dictator, reorganized the republic entirely according to his own preferences, and then done something nobody expected. He had retired, voluntarily surrendering power and walking away. It was an act so astonishing that Romans talked about it for generations. Caesar had watched all of this as a young man. He had lived through Sulla's dictatorship personally. Sulla had actually put Caesar on his list of enemies, and the young Caesar had survived only through the intervention of powerful friends and relatives. He had looked into the face of absolute power wielded by one man and survived. What lesson he drew from that experience would define the rest of his life. Caesar was not born into the top tier of Roman aristocracy. Yes, he was a patrician. Yes, his family claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, a claim Caesar would repeat throughout his life with a straight face and considerable political benefit. But the Julian clan had not produced a consul in living memory. They were respectable, but not powerful, distinguished, but not dominant. Caesar would change that through sheer force of will, intelligence, and a political instinct so refined it bordered on supernatural. His early career was a masterclass in Roman advancement. He studied oratory in Rhodes under the finest teachers available, and he returned to Rome one of the most gifted public speakers of his generation. In a world where political careers were built and destroyed on the floor of the Senate, the ability to speak was not merely useful. It was everything. He spent money he did not have on a scale that alarmed his friends and delighted the Roman public. Games, festivals, public works, gifts to the people. Every sestertius spent was an investment in popularity, and Caesar understood the return on that investment better than any man alive. He formed alliances with ruthless calculation. The most consequential of these was with Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, possibly the wealthiest man in the ancient world. He had made his fortune through a system so cynical it takes a moment to fully absorb. He maintained a private fire brigade in Rome. When a building caught fire, his men would arrive, and Crassus himself would appear and offer to buy the burning property at a fraction of its value. If the owner agreed, the fire was put out. If not, they watched it burn. This was the man Caesar chose as his financial backer. The other alliance was equally consequential. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, the most celebrated military commander of his generation. A man who had triumphed over pirates, over Eastern kings, over anyone Rome had sent him to destroy. In 60 BC, Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey formed what historians call the First Triumvirate. It was not a formal institution. Rome had no legal framework for it. It was a private agreement among three of the most powerful men in the Republic to coordinate their influence and support each other's ambitions. It was, in practical terms, a shadow government operating inside the legitimate one. And it worked. Caesar got what he wanted most from the arrangement: a military command, the governorship of Gaul, the territories that today make up France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany. On the surface, this was simply a prestigious posting, a chance to win military glory and return to Rome with an enhanced reputation. What Caesar did with it was something else entirely. For 8 years, from 58 BC to 50 BC, Caesar waged war across Gaul with a ferocity and brilliance that shocked even his enemies. The numbers are staggering and deeply troubling by any modern moral standard. Ancient sources claim that Caesar's campaigns killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. Modern historians debate the precise figures, but the scale of the destruction was enormous. Entire tribes were exterminated. Cities were burned. A civilization that had flourished for centuries was systematically dismantled. Caesar wrote about all of it himself. His Gallic Wars commentaries are among the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. Written in clean, precise Latin, in the third person as though describing someone else's actions, they are simultaneously a military history, a political document, and one of history's most sophisticated pieces of self-promotion. Caesar was not just fighting wars. He was writing the narrative of those wars for a Roman audience back home. Every dispatch sent back to Rome was a carefully crafted message. Caesar is winning. Caesar is protecting Rome from barbarian threats. Caesar is a general of unprecedented skill and courage. The Roman public loved it. The Senate watched with growing alarm, because with every year that passed, Caesar's army became more than an army. These men had fought together across the Rhine and into Britain. The first Roman general to set foot on that mysterious island. They had survived ambushes in dark forests, sieges that lasted months, and the kind of brutal winter campaigns that broke lesser armies entirely. They were Caesar's men, not Rome's men, not the Senate's men, Caesar's. He paid them from his own pocket when the Senate was slow with funds. He knew their names, their families, their histories. He promoted men of talent regardless of their social class. A revolutionary act in a society built on inherited status. He shared their hardships on campaign. and rewarded their loyalty with the wealth of conquered territories. The bond between Caesar and his legions was not merely professional, it was personal, almost tribal. These soldiers would follow him anywhere, including, as it would turn out, across the Rubicon. The wealth flowing from Gaul was equally transformative. Plunder on an industrial scale. Gold, silver, slaves, tribute. Caesar used it to pay his enormous debts, to fund political allies in Rome, and to build the kind of patron-client network that was the true currency of Roman politics. By 52 BC, when the great Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix led a final massive uprising against Roman rule, Caesar faced the greatest crisis of his military career. Surrounded, outmaneuvered, his supply lines cut, his men starving, he responded with an engineering feat so audacious it remains one of the most studied military operations in history. At Alesia, Caesar besieged Vercingetorix inside a hilltop fortress by building not one but 2 rings of fortifications, one facing inward to contain the Gauls inside the city, one facing outward to defend against the relief army gathering outside. Caesar was simultaneously besieging and being besieged. It should have been impossible. It was not. Vercingetorix surrendered. The relief army was destroyed. Gaul was broken. Caesar stood at the peak of his military power, with the most battle-hardened army in the Roman world at his back, and the love of the Roman people ahead of him. And in Rome, powerful men began asking a question that had no comfortable answer. What exactly was Julius Caesar planning to do next? The confrontation that had been building for years finally crystallized around a single legal question. When exactly would Caesar give up his command? Under Roman law, a general held military authority called imperium only within his province and only for the duration of his appointment. The moment he crossed back into Italy proper, his command ended. He became a private citizen again, and a private citizen could be prosecuted. Caesar's enemies in the Senate, and there were many, had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. The moment his military protection expired. They had prepared legal cases against him for alleged violations during his consulship years earlier. The charges may or may not have had merit. That was almost beside the point. The point was that the moment Caesar became a private citizen, he was vulnerable. Caesar understood this perfectly. He proposed a solution. Allow him to stand for the consulship of 48 BC while still in command of his army. If elected, his official status as consul would protect him from prosecution. He would then lay down his command as required. His enemies refused. The negotiations that followed through the winter of 50 and 49 BC were among the most consequential in ancient history. Letters flew back and forth between Caesar in Gaul and the Senate in Rome. Compromises were proposed and rejected. Lines were drawn and redrawn. On the 7th of January, 49 BC, the Senate passed its ultimate decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, essentially a declaration of emergency that stripped the tribunes protecting Caesar's interests of their authority and ordered Caesar to disband his army immediately or be declared an enemy of the state. 2 tribunes, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, fled Rome in disguise and rode north to Caesar's camp. Caesar called his officers together. He showed them the tribunes. He spoke to his soldiers. And then, on the night of January 10th, he did what no Roman general was supposed to do. He led his army across the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy itself. There is a phrase attributed to Caesar at that moment that has echoed through history ever since. The die is cast. Whether he actually said it, whether it was said in Latin or Greek, whether it was said at all, historians debate endlessly. What cannot be debated is what the crossing meant. It meant war, civil war, Roman against Roman. The thing the Republic had always feared most, had built its entire constitution to prevent, was now happening. Pompey, Caesar's former ally, and now his most powerful enemy, fled Rome with most of the Senate. He had boasted that he needed only to stamp his foot on the ground of Italy, and legions would spring up to fight Caesar. When the moment came, he stamped his foot and heard nothing. Caesar moved south with extraordinary speed. Town after town opened its gates without resistance. Soldiers who had been sent to stop him switched sides instead. The psychological momentum was overwhelming. Within 60 days of crossing the Rubicon, Caesar controlled all of Italy without fighting a single significant battle. It was a campaign of speed, reputation, and terror, so perfectly executed that it seemed almost impossible. But controlling Italy was not winning a war. Pompey had escaped to Greece with the Senate and was raising an enormous army from Rome's eastern territories. Caesar's enemies controlled Spain, Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean. He was surrounded. What happened next would define not just Caesar's fate, but the fate of the Roman world. Caesar moved with the same relentless energy that had characterized his Gallic campaigns. Spain first. He crushed Pompey's forces there in a campaign of breathtaking speed and tactical ingenuity, defeating armies twice his size through maneuver rather than brute force. Then Greece. He crossed the Adriatic with inadequate forces, was nearly destroyed at Dyrrhachium when Pompey outmaneuvered him, and saved himself only by retreating in good order and regrouping. Then Pharsalus. On the 9th of August, 48 BC, Caesar and Pompey met in the decisive battle of the Civil War on the plains of Thessaly. Pompey had nearly twice as many men. His cavalry outnumbered Caesar's by a significant margin. Caesar had something else. He had noticed that Pompey's cavalry were young aristocrats, men who cared deeply about their appearance and their dignity. He instructed his veteran infantry to aim their javelins not at the cavalry horses, but at the riders' faces. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. The cavalry broke and fled. Caesar's veterans swept around Pompey's exposed flank. The battle collapsed into a rout. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the beach by agents of the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, who hoped the gift of Caesar's enemy would earn Roman favor. It did not. Caesar arrived in Egypt, saw Pompey's severed head, and reportedly wept. Whether the tears were genuine or performed, they made excellent political theater. What happened next in Egypt was equally theatrical and considerably more consequential. Cleopatra VII, the brilliant and politically ruthless queen who had been driven from her throne by her brother, allegedly had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, wrapped in a carpet. Whether the story is literally true or legend has blurred the details. The reality is that Caesar and Cleopatra became allies and lovers. Caesar defeated Ptolemy XIII, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne. She would later follow Caesar to Rome and bear him a son, Caesarion, Little Caesar, a child whose very existence raised uncomfortable questions about dynasty and succession that Roman tradition had no framework to answer. Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BC after defeating the last of his enemies at Thapsus in Africa. He was now undeniably the most powerful man in the Roman world. 4 triumphs celebrated in 4 days, games and spectacles on a scale Rome had never seen. The adulation of the Roman people at a pitch that bordered on worship, and the Senate, desperate, frightened, trying to contain a force it could no longer control, began giving him titles. Dictator, not for 6 months, as the traditional emergency appointment specified. Dictator for 10 years, then dictator perpetuo. Dictator in perpetuity, forever. The word king was never used. Roman tradition made that impossible. But dictator perpetuo meant something that was functionally identical. One man, permanent power, no term limit, no colleague sharing authority, no mechanism for removal. The senators who voted for these honors told themselves it was necessary. Told themselves Caesar was still technically operating within Roman constitutional forms. Some of them did not believe it for a moment, and in the marble corridors of Roman power, men who had fought alongside Caesar, men who called themselves his friends, began meeting in small groups and speaking in careful whispers about what needed to be done. The conspiracy that formed against Caesar in the winter of 45 and 44 BC was not a simple story of jealous rivals. It was something more complicated and more tragic than that. Its 2 leading figures were men Caesar had trusted and honored above almost anyone. Marcus Junius Brutus was the son of a woman Caesar had loved. Some ancient sources even suggested, with characteristic Roman indiscretion, that Caesar might have been Brutus's father. True or not, Caesar had treated Brutus with extraordinary favor. He had pardoned him after Pharsalus, where Brutus had fought on Pompey's side. He had appointed him to prestigious positions. He had called him friend. Brutus was not a violent man. He was a philosopher, a reader, a man who genuinely believed in the Roman Republic as an ideal worth dying for. He joined the conspiracy not from personal ambition, but from genuine conviction. He believed Caesar was destroying the system that Rome depended on for its freedom. Gaius Cassius Longinus was a different matter. Cassius was sharper, more calculating, more personally motivated. He had also served under Pompey and been pardoned by Caesar, but the gratitude sat uneasily on him. He was passed over for a position he felt he deserved. He watched Caesar receive divine honors with visible contempt. It was Cassius who recruited Brutus, who understood that the conspiracy needed Brutus's reputation for integrity to succeed, who said, according to ancient accounts, that Caesar's name was as powerful as his body, and that Brutus's name was the only weapon that could match it. There were eventually 60 or more men involved in the plot. 60 men meeting in small groups, exchanging glances in the Senate, carrying concealed weapons beneath their togas, and somehow keeping their secret in one of the most gossip-saturated cities in the ancient world. Caesar had been warned multiple times. His wife Calpurnia dreamed of his murder the night before and begged him not to go to the Senate on the Ides of March. A soothsayer named Spurina had warned him months earlier to beware the Ides. A letter listing the names of the conspirators was pressed into his hand as he walked to the Senate meeting. He tucked it unread under his arm, intending to read it later. He never did. Why did Caesar not take these warnings seriously? The question has fascinated historians ever since. Some argue he was simply too confident, too accustomed to bending Rome to his will to believe it could strike back. Some argue he was genuinely tired. He had been ill. He spoke in the weeks before his death of going east, leading a great campaign against Parthia, the empire that had humiliated Rome when Crassus died at Carrhae. Perhaps part of him welcomed the motion, the campaign, the escape from the endless politics of Rome. Some argue he simply did not think the Senate was capable of it. He had disbanded his personal bodyguard. He had pardoned his enemies repeatedly. He believed, or chose to believe, that clemency was strength. On the morning of the Ides of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar walked to his appointment with history, and with the men who had decided that the only way to save Rome was to kill the man who embodied it. The Senate met that day not in the Senate House, which was being renovated, but in a hall attached to the theater of Pompey. The irony was not lost on observers afterward. Caesar would die in the shadow of the man he had defeated. The conspirators had arranged themselves around Caesar's chair. As he sat down, one of them approached with a petition, grabbing Caesar's toga as if to make a point, and pulling it down from his shoulder. It was the signal. The daggers came out. 23 wounds, according to the physician who examined the body afterward. Only one of them, a thrust to the chest, was immediately fatal. The others suggest a frenzied, chaotic attack by men who had perhaps never killed anyone before. Caesar at first attempted to fight back, using his stylus as a weapon. When he saw Brutus among the attackers, he covered his face with his toga. Whether he said the famous words "et tu, Brute" and "you too, Brutus" is almost certainly a fiction of later imagination. Shakespeare made them immortal, but they are not in the ancient sources. What is in the sources is the chaos that followed. The conspirators had planned the assassination carefully. They had planned almost nothing else. They had assumed that Rome would react with relief and gratitude, that the Senate would applaud, that the Roman people would recognize in Caesar's death the restoration of their beloved republic. None of that happened. The Senate fled in panic. The conspirators marched to the Capitol to make speeches, and found that the streets were not filling with celebrating citizens. They were filling with confused and frightened people who did not know what to think. Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal lieutenant, moved with extraordinary speed. He secured Caesar's papers and his treasury. He arranged a public funeral where he delivered a speech over Caesar's body so masterful in its manipulation of the crowd's emotions that it triggered riots. The conspirators, who had expected to be hailed as liberators, found themselves fleeing Rome for their lives. Caesar had left something else behind: his will. It left his gardens to the Roman people as a public park. It left every Roman citizen a personal gift of money. And it named as his heir not Caesarion, his son by Cleopatra, but his great-nephew, a quiet 18-year-old studying in Greece named Gaius Octavius. The world would come to know him as Augustus. The men who killed Caesar to save the Republic had instead triggered another civil war, one that would finally, definitively, and permanently end the Republic they had died to protect. The crown Caesar had almost stolen was picked up by the boy he had chosen, who wore it more carefully, more patiently, and more permanently than Caesar had ever managed. We return to the question that opened this documentary. Was the conspiracy right? Was Caesar actually reaching for a crown? The evidence points in two directions simultaneously. Against the theory of kingship, Caesar consistently and publicly rejected the title of king. At the Lupercalia festival in February of 44 BC, just weeks before his death, Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a diadem, the symbol of monarchy. Caesar refused it 3 times, according to accounts. The crowd cheered each refusal. He was also genuinely working on practical problems. His administrative reforms were intelligent and lasting. The Julian calendar he introduced remained in use across Europe for over 15 centuries. He was planning infrastructure, colonies, a great library. These were not the acts of a man focused solely on accumulating personal power. For the theory of kingship, the dictator perpetuo title spoke for itself. Permanent dictatorship was monarchy in everything but name. He had his image placed on Roman coins during his lifetime, something no Roman had ever done. He wore the red boots traditionally associated with the ancient kings of Alba Longa. He received divine honors. He had a month named after him, and perhaps most tellingly, he was making no obvious preparations to restore the Republic. No plan to step down, no successor mechanism that involved the Senate or the Roman people in any meaningful way. The most honest answer history can provide is this: Caesar had traveled so far beyond the boundaries of what the Roman constitution could contain that the question of whether he wanted a crown had become almost academic. He was already a king in every practical sense. The title was the only thing missing, and the men who killed him understood that once the title came, nothing would ever be the same again. They were right about that, at least. But in killing Caesar to prevent a king, they guaranteed an emperor. The republic they died to save would be gone within 15 years. In 44 BC, 23 men with daggers ended the life of the most consequential individual in the history of the ancient world. They believed they were saving Rome. They were ending it. The hidden war Julius Caesar fought against Rome was never really about a crown. It was about something older and more dangerous than any title. It was about whether one man's genius, ambition, and will could outlast the institutions that a civilization had spent 5 centuries building to contain exactly that kind of man. The answer Rome gave on the Ides of March was yes. And the answer history gave in the decades that followed was that it did not matter, because the system that killed Caesar was already too broken to survive his death. The crown he almost stole was stolen anyway, just by someone else, just more quietly, just more permanently. And Rome, the republic that had thrown out its kings 5 centuries before, became an empire that would last another 500 years, built on the ashes of everything the conspirators had tried to save. Julius Caesar did not destroy the Roman Republic. He simply made it impossible to pretend it still existed. That may have been the most dangerous thing he ever did. Subscribe for more stories told from the side that lost.